Hey guys, we talk about World War II. What if I told you that the deadliest war in human history, a war that killed over 70 million people, a war that burned entire cities to ash, a war that produced horrors so unspeakable that we still struggle to describe them? What if I told you that this war didn't begin with a gunshot or a bomb or even a battle? What if I told you it began with a piece of paper, a document signed in a palace outside Paris, a document drafted by exhausted diplomats who had just watched an entire generation of young men die in the mud of the trenches, a document that was supposed to end war forever? And here's the thing that keeps me up at night when I think about it. Some of the men who signed it, some of the men who put their pens to that paper knew. They knew even as the ink dried, even as the cameras flashed, even as the champagne was poured, they knew this treaty was a time bomb. They signed it anyway. And 20 years later, the world paid for it in blood. Chapter 1. The Broken Peace. The year is 1919. The Great War, what we now call World War I, has just ended, and the silence is almost unbearable. For 4 years, Europe had been consumed by a war unlike anything the world had ever seen. Millions of men had died in trenches, barely wider than a hallway, fighting over fields of mud that gained or lost a few hundred yards at a time. Poison gas drifted across no man's land. Artillery barrages lasted for days without stopping. Entire towns in France and Belgium were simply erased from the map. By the time it was over, somewhere between 17 and 20 million people were dead. And the survivors, the soldiers who came home, the families who had waited for them, the governments that had sent them, they were all asking the same question: how do we make sure this never happens again? That question brought the leaders of the world to a palace just outside Paris, a palace called Versailles. And there, in the Hall of Mirrors, the same grand hall where the German Empire had been proclaimed just 48 years earlier, the victorious Allied powers sat down to write the terms of peace. Britain was there, France was there, the United States was there, represented by an idealistic president named Woodrow Wilson, who arrived in Europe with a briefcase full of dreams and a plan. He called his 14 points a vision for a new world order built on democracy, self-determination, and a new international body called the League of Nations that would resolve disputes peacefully so that wars would become obsolete. The crowds in Paris cheered Wilson like he was a messiah. They threw flowers at his motorcade. Women wept in the streets. He had no idea what was waiting for him inside that room. Because here is the thing about Versailles that history books often gloss over. The men sitting across the table from Wilson, the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and especially the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, they had very different ideas about what this peace treaty was supposed to accomplish. Clemenceau was 78 years old. He had lived through 2 German invasions of France in his lifetime. He had watched an entire generation of French young men die on French soil. And he was not interested in Wilson's beautiful theories about a new world order. He wanted Germany crushed. He wanted Germany humiliated. He wanted Germany bled dry. He wanted to make absolutely certain that Germany could never, ever do this again. And so, the treaty that emerged from Versailles was not a peace built on Wilson's lofty ideals. It was a peace built on punishment. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for starting the war. The infamous War Guilt Clause, Article 231. Germany was ordered to pay war reparations so enormous, 132 billion gold marks, an almost incomprehensible sum that economists at the time said Germany could not possibly pay them without being economically destroyed. Germany's army was slashed to just 100,000 men. Its navy was scuttled. Its air force was banned entirely. Its overseas colonies were taken away. Entire territories were stripped from German soil and handed to neighboring countries. Over 13% of Germany's pre-war territory and about 10% of its population simply ceased to be German. And then, the representatives of Germany were brought into that room. They were not given a seat at the negotiating table. They were handed the document and told to sign it. And the German foreign minister, Count Brockdorff-Rantzau, stood up and said something remarkable. He said, "We are required to admit that we alone are war guilty. Such an admission on my lips would be a lie." They were made to sign it anyway. The German people called it the Diktat, the dictated peace. And the humiliation, the burning, searing, national humiliation of that moment burrowed into the German psyche like a wound that would not heal. Historians have debated for a century whether Versailles made World War II inevitable. The short answer is probably not inevitable, but it made the rise of exactly the kind of rage-filled, revanchist, nationalist politics that produced Adolf Hitler almost unavoidable. Because into that wound, into that humiliation, into that economic devastation, into that national identity crisis, stepped a man with a very simple message. We were betrayed, we were stabbed in the back, and I will make Germany great again. His name was Adolf Hitler, and in 1919, he was nobody. He was a failed artist from Austria. He had served as a corporal in the German army during the war, a brave soldier by most accounts, but never an officer, never anyone of importance. He was 30 years old, living in Munich, and he had just discovered something unexpected. He could talk. He could get up in front of a room full of angry, confused, economically desperate people, the kind of people Germany was full of in the 1920s, and he could hold them. He could make them feel that their rage was justified, that their suffering had a cause, that there were enemies responsible for all of it: the Jews, the communists, the weak politicians who had surrendered in 1918, the foreign powers who had written Versailles. He was electric. Even people who despised his ideology admitted it. He had an almost supernatural ability to read a crowd and give them exactly what they needed to feel. And in the broken, humiliated, economically shattered Germany of the 1920s, a lot of people needed exactly what he was offering. The 1920s were a disaster for Germany in ways that most people in the English-speaking world have forgotten. The inflation crisis of 1923 was so severe that the German currency, the mark, essentially became worthless. People were carrying banknotes in wheelbarrows to buy a loaf of bread. Lifetime savings were wiped out overnight. People who had worked their entire lives, who had done everything right, suddenly had nothing. Then came 1929 and the Great Depression, and if the 1920s had been bad, the 1930s were catastrophic. Unemployment in Germany hit 30%. Streets filled with men who had no work, no prospects, no future. The democratic government, the Weimar Republic, a fragile, complicated, deeply imperfect democracy, seemed incapable of doing anything about it. And Hitler's party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, kept growing. In 1928, they had won barely 2% of the vote in national elections, almost irrelevant. In 1932, they won 37%. Because when people are desperate, truly desperate, hungry and humiliated and afraid, they don't look for moderate solutions. They look for someone who sounds like they have answers, someone who sounds strong, someone who sounds certain, in a world that has become terrifyingly uncertain. Hitler sounded certain, and then, on January 30th, 1933, it happened. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He had not seized power at gunpoint. He had been invited in by the conservative politicians who thought they could control him. They thought they could use his popularity, his base, his ability to mobilize the masses and then manage him, contain him, use him as a tool. It is one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in the history of human politics. Within months, Hitler had systematically dismantled every institution of German democracy. The Reichstag, the parliament, was effectively neutered after a fire that Hitler blamed on the communists. Trade unions were abolished. Opposition parties were banned. The press was brought under state control. The judiciary was packed with Nazi loyalists. And then, in August 1934, German President Paul von Hindenburg died. Hitler absorbed the presidency into the chancellorship. He declared himself Führer leader of the German people. He was 45 years old. He had gone from nobody to absolute dictator in 5 years. And now he had a plan. The plan, in its simplest form, was this. Germany had been wronged. The German people, whom Hitler believed to be a master race, a biologically superior people deserving of a vast empire in the East, had been cheated of their rightful destiny by enemies within and without. And Hitler was going to fix that. He would rearm Germany in defiance of Versailles. He would reclaim German territories. He would unite all German-speaking peoples under a single Reich. And then, and this is where his ambitions left reality behind entirely, he would conquer living space, Lebensraum, in Eastern Europe and Russia, enslaving or eliminating the Slavic peoples who lived there, and building a German empire that would last 1,000 years. He said all of this publicly, in speeches, in his book, Mein Kampf, which he had written in prison after a failed coup attempt in 1923. Nobody took him seriously. Or rather, not enough people took him seriously. Soon enough, the other nations of Europe watched Hitler consolidate power, watched Germany rearm, watched the Nazis begin their systematic persecution of Jewish people, and they did not very much. Britain and France, the two great powers of Western Europe, were exhausted. Their societies were still processing the trauma of the First World War. Their populations were deeply anti-war. The memory of the trenches was so horrifying, so vivid, that the idea of another war was simply unthinkable. And so they chose a policy that history has judged harshly, but which you have to understand in its context: appeasement. They would give Hitler what he asked for within reason, in the hope that it would satisfy him, in the hope that he actually meant what he sometimes said about limited territorial ambitions, in the hope that another war could be avoided. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich, actually flew to meet Hitler personally, the first British Prime Minister ever to travel by airplane, and negotiated an agreement that handed Hitler the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, in exchange for a promise that this was his last territorial demand. Chamberlain came home waving a piece of paper. "Peace for our time," he said. 6 months later, Hitler invaded what remained of Czechoslovakia. 6 months after that, he invaded Poland. And the world that had been holding its breath for 20 years finally exhaled, in fire. But before we get there, I want you to hold this moment for just a second, because I think about those 20 years a lot. Those 20 years between the treaties and the tanks, those 20 years when the world could see what was coming, could feel it building, and yet somehow couldn't find a way to stop it. There were people in those years who tried to sound the alarm. Winston Churchill spent most of the 1930s warning anyone who would listen about Hitler. He was mostly ignored, dismissed as a warmonger, a man living in the past. There were German officers who hated Hitler and dreamed of removing him, but never quite found the moment, never quite found the courage to act, until it was too late. There were diplomats and statesmen who knew the League of Nations was failing, who knew Versailles had created a crisis with no good solution, who stayed up late trying to find some path through the maze that didn't end in catastrophe. They didn't find it, and on September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled into Poland. And the Second World War, the greatest catastrophe in human history, had begun. We are just at the beginning of this story. There is so much more to come. The miracle at Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain fought in summer skies, above English fields, Pearl Harbor, and the sleeping giant that woke up swinging, the frozen hell of Stalingrad, the darkest chapter humanity has ever written, the turning tides, the longest day on a beach in Normandy, and finally, the bomb that ended everything and changed everything forever. But for now, settle in. We're just getting started. Chapter 2. The world holds its breath. September 1st, 1939. 4:45 inches the morning. Poland is asleep. And then the bombs start falling. No declaration of war, no warning. Just the sudden, roaring thunder of German aircraft appearing out of the pre-dawn darkness, dropping fire on Polish airfields, on railway lines, on cities. And behind them, crossing the border at a dozen points simultaneously, came the tanks. This was something the world had never seen before. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And it was exactly that. A storm so fast, so violent, so perfectly coordinated between air power and ground forces that the Polish army barely had time to react before it was being encircled, cut off, and destroyed. Poland had a brave army. Let nobody tell you otherwise. Polish cavalry units, yes, cavalry, on horses, charged German tank formations. Not because they were stupid, because they had nothing else. And they charged anyway. It didn't matter. Within days, the shape of the battle was already decided. And then, on September 17th, something happened that Poland never saw coming. The Soviet Union from the east invaded as well. Hitler and Stalin had signed a secret pact just weeks earlier. They had agreed to divide Poland between them, like men cutting a cake. And now, the knife came from both sides at once. Poland, a nation that had only been reborn 20 years earlier, that had fought for its independence, that had a culture and a language and a history stretching back centuries, was erased from the map in 35 days. 35 days. Britain and France had promised to defend Poland. When Germany invaded, they honored that promise. They declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939. And then they did almost nothing. Not because they were cowards, but because they genuinely didn't know what to do. Their military plans were defensive. Their mindset was still shaped by the trenches of the last war: dig in, fortify, wait. France had built an enormous defensive line along its border with Germany, the Maginot Line, bristling with guns and fortifications. The plan was essentially to sit behind it and let Germany exhaust itself trying to break through. Historians call the period from September 1939 to April 1940 the Phony War. Nothing much happened on the Western Front. British troops crossed the Channel and took up positions in France. Officers played cards, soldiers wrote letters home. Some newspapers started wondering if Hitler would just stop, if maybe there wouldn't really be a proper war in the West after all. They were about to find out. On May 10th, 1940, Hitler launched his attack in the West, and he did something that almost nobody expected. Rather than smashing directly into the Maginot Line, which is what the French and British high commands had spent months preparing for, the Germans sent their main armored force through the Ardennes forest, a dense, hilly, almost roadless forest on the border between Germany, Luxembourg, and Belgium that military planners had considered essentially impassable for tanks. They were wrong. The German tanks emerged from the Ardennes like a blade driving straight for the English Channel, cutting behind the entire Allied line. Within days, the best British and French forces, the ones that had moved north into Belgium to meet what they thought was the main German attack, were surrounded. Cut off from supply lines, cut off from retreat, pushed back toward a small port town on the northern coast of France, a town called Dunkirk. Now, I need you to picture this. It is late May 1940. On the beaches and the dunes around Dunkirk, there are approximately 400,000 Allied soldiers. British, French, Belgian. They are exhausted. They are hungry. Many of them are wounded. German forces are closing in from three sides. The sea is behind them. The Royal Navy looks at the situation and concludes it can maybe rescue 45,000 men before the Germans overrun the position. Maybe, which means the rest, more than 300,000 men, are looking at death or capture. And then someone in London has an idea. They put out a call to anyone with a boat, any boat, privately owned boats, fishing boats, pleasure cruisers, river ferries, lifeboats, tugboats, anything that can cross the English Channel and carry men. And Britain answered. 850 vessels crossed the Channel. School teachers on weekend sailboats. Retired fishermen in vessels barely big enough for a family holiday. Men who had never sailed in anything approaching a war zone, who had never seen a bomb fall or a fighter plane strafe a beach, crossing 21 miles of open water under German air attack because there were men stranded on a beach and someone had to go get them. Over 9 days that the world watched in disbelief, they pulled 338,000 men off that beach. 338,000. It was called a miracle, and it was. But Churchill stood up in Parliament and said something important. He said, "Do not think this is a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." He was right. The fall of France was still coming, and it came fast. On June 22nd, 1940, France surrendered. The speed of it was shocking even to the Germans. The country that had held the Western Front for 4 years in the last war, that had bled itself white to stop the German advance, fell in 6 weeks. The surrender ceremony was deliberately staged by Hitler in the same railway carriage, in the same forest clearing at Compiègne, where Germany had signed the armistice in 1918. Hitler had the original carriage brought out of a museum specifically for this purpose. The humiliation of 1918 reversed. Repaid, Hitler's revenge was complete. And now only one country stood between Nazi Germany and total domination of Western Europe. Britain. There's a moment in the summer of 1940 that I think about often, because it's one of those moments where you can genuinely see history hinging on a single decision. Winston Churchill had only been Prime Minister for a few weeks when France fell. He had replaced Chamberlain on the same day Germany invaded, May 10th, 1940, and immediately his war cabinet was pressuring him to consider negotiating with Hitler, not surrendering, but negotiating, finding some kind of settlement, preserving what could be preserved. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, a powerful, respected, reasonable man, argued the case quietly, privately, inside those cabinet rooms. There might be terms that Britain could accept, terms that stopped the war before Britain was bombed into ruin. It was worth at least exploring. Churchill sat with it. And then he said, no. He went out and he gave those speeches, the ones that schoolchildren memorize, the ones that still raise the hairs on your arms when you hear the recordings. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender. People sometimes think those words were propaganda. Churchill, performing for the public, projecting a confidence he didn't feel. I don't think that's right. I think in that room, in that summer, Churchill looked at what Nazi Germany was and understood at a bone-deep level that there was no deal to be made. That negotiation with Hitler was a trap, that the only way through was through, and Britain, battered, isolated, standing alone, decided to fight. What followed is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of aerial warfare. Hitler needed to invade Britain. To invade Britain, he needed to cross the English Channel with an amphibious force, something immensely difficult and dangerous, even under the best conditions. To do that safely, he needed air superiority over the Channel and the landing zones. To get that air superiority, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had to destroy the Royal Air Force, and so began what Churchill called the Battle of Britain. All through the summer of 1940, July, August, into September, the skies above southern England became a battlefield. German bombers came in waves, escorted by fighters. RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes rose to meet them. Every day, sometimes multiple times a day. The numbers were brutal. At the start of the battle, the RAF had about 650 serviceable fighter aircraft. The Luftwaffe had over 2,500 planes of all types deployed for the campaign. But a few things changed the math. One, Britain had radar. The world's first operational radar network, called Chain Home, could detect incoming German formations while they were still over France. That gave the RAF precious minutes to scramble and position their fighters before the Germans arrived. 2. The pilots. RAF pilots, who were shot down over England, could parachute to safety, receive medical care, and sometimes be flying again within days. German pilots shot down over England were taken prisoner. The Germans were losing men they couldn't easily replace. 3. Spitfires. I know I have to say something about Spitfires. They were extraordinary aircraft, elegant in a way that fighter planes rarely are. Those elliptical wings, that screaming Rolls-Royce engine, and the men who flew them were something else entirely. The average age of an RAF fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain was 20 years old. 20. Some of them had barely learned to fly before they were being thrown into combat 3 or 4 times a day. They were taking off exhausted, landing exhausted, sleeping in their flight suits beside their aircraft so they could scramble faster. Some of them lasted weeks. Some lasted days, but they held. In early September 1940, the battle reached its crisis point. The Luftwaffe had been systematically attacking RAF airfields, radar stations, and infrastructure. It was working. The RAF was being ground down. Some airfields had been bombed so repeatedly they were barely functional. Pilot losses were climbing faster than new pilots could be trained. A few more weeks of this, and the RAF might genuinely crack. And then the Germans made a mistake. On the night of August 24th, a German bomber accidentally dropped bombs on civilian areas of London. Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. Hitler was furious. He had promised the German people Berlin would never be bombed, and in a rage, he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its attacks from RAF airfields to London itself. The Blitz had begun, and paradoxically, it saved the RAF. Because instead of continuing to pound the airfields into rubble, the Germans were now bombing cities, which was horrifying. For Londoners' 57 consecutive nights of bombing, 43,000 civilians killed across Britain during the entire Blitz. But it gave the RAF the breathing room they desperately needed to repair their airfields, rest their pilots, bring up new aircraft. On September 15th, 1940, now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched its largest single raid on London, and the RAF met it in force. By the end of that day, the Germans had lost 61 aircraft. The RAF had lost 31. More importantly, Hermann Göring's promise to Hitler that the Luftwaffe could destroy the RAF in a matter of weeks was exposed as a lie. On September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. He never rescheduled it. Britain had survived. And sitting in their homes, in their bomb shelters, in their blacked-out houses, listening to German bombers overhead, the British people heard a voice on the radio that told them, night after night, that they were not alone, that what they were enduring meant something, that the darkness would not last forever. Churchill's voice, gravelly, unhurried, waited with the full seriousness of what was happening, but never despairing. Never despairing. "This is not the end," he said after one of the war's early reverses. "It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." Britain held through 1940, and the war, which had seemed almost over, which had seemed like Hitler might simply win ground, on into 1941, into something much, much bigger. Chapter 3. The Sleeping Giant Wakes. December 7th, 1941. A Sunday morning. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 7:48 a.m. The USS Arizona is sitting at anchor in the warm Pacific sun. Sailors are eating breakfast. Some are still asleep. A Navy band is preparing for the morning flag-raising ceremony on a nearby vessel. It is, by all accounts, a beautiful morning, and then the sky fills with aircraft. 353 Japanese planes, fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, come in two waves across the blue Hawaiian sky. They have flown from aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles to the north in complete secrecy, undetected. The attack lasts less than 2 hours. In those 2 hours, the USS Arizona takes a direct hit to its forward ammunition magazine. The explosion is so catastrophic, so instantaneous and total that the ship sinks in 9 minutes. 1,177 men go down with it. To this day, the Arizona remains on the sea floor of Pearl Harbor. The remains of her crew are still inside. It is considered a war grave. By the time the last Japanese plane turns back toward its carrier, 2,403 Americans are dead. 19 naval vessels have been sunk or damaged. 328 aircraft have been destroyed or damaged on the ground. The Pacific Fleet of the United States Navy has been gutted in a single Sunday morning. Now, here's what you need to understand about America in December 1941. The United States had been watching the war in Europe for 2 years, watching Britain struggle alone, watching the Nazi Empire spread across the continent, watching the reports coming out of occupied Europe with growing horror, and the American public was deeply, passionately divided about what to do about it. On one side, the interventionists, people who argued that Hitler represented an existential threat to democracy everywhere, that Britain needed American support, that staying out of this war was not neutrality, but cowardice. On the other side, the isolationists, people who said this was Europe's war, not America's, that America had sent its boys to die in the trenches in 1917 and got nothing but heartbreak for it, that America should stay home, stay safe, and let the old world sort out its own mess. The isolationist movement was enormous and politically powerful. Its most prominent spokesperson was Charles Lindbergh, the most famous man in America, the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic, a genuine hero to millions. And Lindbergh was giving speeches all across the country saying, "Stay out of this war. This is not our fight." President Franklin Roosevelt privately believed America had to get involved. He had been carefully, quietly doing everything he could to help Britain, sending weapons, ships, supplies under a program called Lend-Lease. He had met Churchill secretly in the middle of the Atlantic on a battleship, and together they had drafted a document called the Atlantic Charter, laying out a vision for the post-war world. But he could not bring the American public with him, not yet. Not without something that would change everything. December 7th, 1941. Was that something? Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day. He had drafted a short speech, precise, controlled, no wasted words. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The speech lasted 7 minutes. Congress declared war on Japan in under an hour. The vote in the Senate was 82-0. In the House, 388-1. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Hitler did not have to do this. There was no treaty obligation that required it. It was arguably one of the greatest strategic blunders of the entire war, taking a nation that had been carefully sitting on the sidelines and giving it no choice but to join the fight against you. But Hitler seemed almost relieved. He had always seen America as an inevitable enemy. He told his associates he preferred to deal with it openly. He had no idea what he had just woken up, because America went to war the way only America could. Within months, not years, months, the transformation was staggering. Automobile factories stopped making cars and started making tanks and aircraft. Women flooded into factories that had never employed them before, working around the clock on assembly lines, producing the weapons of war. Rosie the Riveter became the face of an industrial revolution. The United States was about to outproduce every other nation on Earth, on both sides combined. By 1944, American factories were producing a new ship every single day. Aircraft were coming off production lines faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. The industrial output was so overwhelming, so relentless, that American generals started talking not about whether they had enough equipment, but about how to move it all to where it needed to be. The man who had done this, who had started mobilizing even before Pearl Harbor, who had seen it coming and positioned America to respond, was Franklin Roosevelt. Already crippled by polio, already governing from a wheelchair, now steering the most powerful nation on Earth through its greatest test. Roosevelt and Churchill would speak almost daily by phone for the rest of the war. Their relationship, unequal, sometimes tense, deeply affectionate, was one of the most consequential partnerships in modern history. But in the Pacific, in those first terrible months, none of that industrial power had arrived yet, and Japan was moving fast. The Japanese had been at war since 1937, grinding through China in a campaign of breathtaking brutality. The rape of Nanking in December of that year had seen Japanese forces massacre somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war over 6 weeks. The numbers are still disputed. The horror is not. Japan's military leadership had a vision, a vast Pacific empire they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a network of territories from Manchuria down through Southeast Asia across the Pacific Islands, providing Japan with the oil, rubber, and raw materials it needed to fuel its industrial and military machine. After Pearl Harbor, they moved to complete that vision with terrifying speed. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 194118 days after Pearl Harbor. The Philippines, despite fierce American and Filipino resistance, fell in May 1942. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to evacuate before the fall. He left by torpedo boat in the middle of the night and famously promised the Filipino people, "I shall return." Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, the Gibraltar of the East, defended by 85,000 troops, fell on February 15, 1942 to a Japanese force of 36,000 men who had simply come through the jungle from the north on bicycles. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. He wasn't wrong. Wake Island, Guam, Burma, Malaya. In 6 months, Japan had seized an empire stretching across millions of square miles of ocean and territory. The psychological impact was seismic. For over a century, Asian peoples had watched European powers, Britain, France, the Netherlands, hold vast colonial empires across Asia, backed by the presumption that Western military power was simply unbeatable. Japan had just shown that presumption for what it was. That moment, Singapore falling, the British surrendering in their tens of thousands to a smaller Japanese force, planted a seed that would, in the post-war years, grow into the independence movements that ended European colonialism across Asia. But that's another story for another night. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled most of the Pacific. And the question, the desperate, urgent question in Washington and in the remaining Allied positions across the region was, where do they stop? Can they be stopped? The answer came at a tiny, remote atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Midway. This story begins with a codebreaker. His name was Commander Joseph Rochefort, and he worked in a basement in Pearl Harbor, a cramped, windowless space his team called the Dungeon, where a group of cryptanalysts were slowly, painstakingly breaking the Japanese naval code. Japanese naval communications were encrypted in a code called JN25. It was immensely complex. But by the spring of 1942, Rochefort's team had broken enough of it to read the broad outlines of Japanese message traffic, and what they were reading alarmed them. The Japanese were planning a massive operation. The target was designated in the coded messages only as AF, and it was clearly somewhere in the Pacific. The operation was designed to draw out and destroy what remained of the American Pacific Fleet in a mast. Single, decisive battle. But where was AF? Rochefort had a hunch. It was Midway, and he devised a clever trap to prove it. He had the Midway garrison send a radio message in plain, unencrypted language, reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese communications reported that AF was experiencing a freshwater shortage. AF was Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the quiet, steady Texan who commanded the Pacific Fleet, now had the information he needed. He knew where the Japanese were going, roughly when they were coming, and approximately how many ships they were bringing. What he had to work with: 3 aircraft carriers. The Japanese were bringing 4, plus a battleship fleet that dwarfed anything Nimitz could put in the water. On paper, this was not a fight America could win. On June 4th, 1942, the Japanese fleet appeared northwest of Midway. What followed over the next 4 days was one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in the history of naval warfare. Japanese aircraft attacked Midway's installations. American aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet and suffered devastating losses in the first attempts. Torpedo bombers, flying slow and low without fighter escort, cut down almost to the last plane. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked in the opening waves, 35 were shot down. 35, the survivors pressed their attacks, knowing they were flying into certain death. They didn't sink a single Japanese ship. But their sacrifice, those men in slow planes flying into walls of anti-aircraft fire, pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level. And at that exact moment, diving from 19,000 feet, American dive bombers broke through the clouds above the Japanese fleet. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were fatally hit. Their flight decks torn open, their fuel lines ruptured, their aircraft armed and fueled and ready to launch turned into infernos. A 4th Japanese carrier was caught and sunk later that day. 4 carriers. The same 4 carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Gone in a single day. Japan lost 3,057 men at Midway. It lost aircraft it could replace eventually, but it could not replace the experienced pilots and the trained aircrew who went down with those carriers. The institutional knowledge, the combat experience, the irreplaceable human expertise burned and sunk to the bottom of the Pacific. Japan would never again hold the strategic initiative in the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most gifted naval commander Japan possessed, had predicted this moment before the war even began. When Japanese leaders celebrated after Pearl Harbor, he had reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually said those words is disputed by historians, but the sentiment was entirely accurate. America was awake now, and it was not going back to sleep. But while the Pacific War turned on aircraft carriers and coral atolls and the vast blue distances of the ocean on the other side of the world, an entirely different kind of war was being fought. A war not of sea and sky and speed. A war of mud and cold and utter, grinding, unimaginable brutality. A war on the Eastern Front that would make everything we have talked about tonight look, by comparison, almost restrained. That is where we are going next. Chapter 4. Hell on Earth, June 22nd, 1941. 3. 15 inches the morning. Along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, the ground begins to shake. German artillery opens up along the entire length of the Soviet border simultaneously. The barrage is so massive, so sustained, that people in villages miles away think there has been an earthquake. Birds rise from forests in panicking clouds. Windows shatter in towns that aren't even close to the front. And then 3 million German soldiers, the largest invasion force ever assembled in the history of human warfare, cross into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Stalin had been warned. He had been warned by British intelligence, which had broken the German Enigma code and could see the build-up coming. He had been warned by his own spies inside Germany. He had been warned by a Soviet agent in Tokyo, a man named Richard Sorge, one of the most remarkable intelligence operatives of the entire war, who had sent detailed reports about German invasion plans months in advance. Stalin ignored all of it. He had convinced himself that Hitler would not break the non-aggression pact they had signed in 1939, that Germany needed Soviet oil and grain too much to risk war in the East, that the warnings were British propaganda designed to drag the Soviet Union into a conflict that would benefit Britain at Soviet expense. When the first reports of German attacks came in on the morning of June 22nd, Soviet commanders along the border were sending frantic messages to Moscow asking for permission to return fire. Stalin's response was to accuse them of panicking. Some Soviet units, following orders not to provoke Germany, didn't even shoot back in the opening hours. The result was catastrophic. In the first days of Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht moved with a speed and coordination that stunned the entire world. Soviet airfields were hit in the opening hours. Over 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, many of them still on the ground. Entire Soviet armies were encircled in massive pincer movements, huge sweeping arcs of German armor that closed behind Soviet formations before they could retreat, trapping hundreds of thousands of men at a time. At the Battle of Białystok-Minsk in the first week, a name most people have never heard, the Germans encircled and captured over 300,000 Soviet troops, 300,000 in 1 week. At Kyiv in September, an encirclement so vast it beggars belief. 665,000 Soviet soldiers captured in a single operation. It remains the largest encirclement in military history. By December 1941, the Germans had advanced 1,000 miles into Soviet territory. They had killed, captured, or wounded an almost incomprehensible number of Soviet soldiers. Estimates range between 4 and 5 million in the first 6 months alone. Numbers so large they stop meaning anything. So let me make it smaller. Imagine a village. A small Soviet village somewhere in Western Russia. A few hundred people. Farmers, mostly. A school. A church that had been converted to a grain store. Under Stalin's collectivization program, the Germans arrive. In the best cases, they pass through. In many cases, they don't. Because behind the fighting units came other men, the SS Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, and their orders were explicit. Soviet political commissars shoot them. Jewish people shoot them. Partisans, or anyone suspected of supporting partisans, shoot them. And anyone who resists, or protests, or simply gets in the way, shoot them. The Eastern Front was not the same war as the Western Front. In the West, the Germans fought broadly, with significant exceptions by something resembling the rules of warfare. Prisoners were taken. Civilians were sometimes protected. In the East, from the very beginning, Hitler had made clear this was a different kind of war. A war of annihilation. A racial war. A war where the Slavic people of the Soviet Union were considered subhuman Untermenschen to be enslaved, displaced, or killed in the service of German Lebensraum. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, 3.3 million died in captivity. Deliberately starved, worked to death, shot, left to die in open fields behind barbed wire in the Russian winter. 3.3 million. In contrast, of British and American prisoners held by Germany, roughly 4% died in captivity. Of Soviet prisoners, 57%. Same war, different rules, different people, and yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. This was what Hitler had counted on. His generals had planned for a campaign of 8 to 10 weeks. A swift, brutal strike that would shatter the Soviet state before it could recover. Hitler famously said, "We only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." The door did not come crashing down. Part of the reason was Stalin himself. Whatever his catastrophic failures in the opening weeks, and they were catastrophic, Stalin found something in the crisis that he had rarely shown before, a kind of grim, ferocious steadiness. He did not flee Moscow when the Germans were at its outskirts in October 1941. When his generals urged him to evacuate the capital, he stayed. That decision mattered more than almost any battle, because Moscow was the symbol, and symbols, in a war of this scale, in a country of this size, with a people fighting this desperately, symbols matter enormously. Stalin broadcast to the Soviet people on the radio. He called it the Great Patriotic War. He invoked not Marxist ideology, but Russian history, the memory of Alexander Nevsky defeating the Teutonic Knights, of Kutuzov resisting Napoleon. He told them they were fighting for their homes, their families, their land, their very existence as a people, and the Soviet people who had suffered enormously under Stalin's own terror, who had watched neighbors disappear in the night, who had been starved and collectivized and purged, many of them chose to fight anyway, because the alternative, what the Germans were offering, was worse. The German advance began to slow in the autumn of 1941. Partly the distances. The Soviet Union is almost incomprehensibly vast, and German supply lines were stretching to the breaking point. Tanks needed fuel. Soldiers needed food. Ammunition had to come forward over roads that autumn rains turned to mud so deep that vehicles sank to their axles and had to be abandoned. The Germans had a word for it: Rasputitsa, the mud season. Twice a year, autumn and spring, the Russian landscape turned to a quagmire that could swallow armies. And then came the winter. The German army had not been equipped for a Russian winter, because the plan was that the war would be over before winter. So, soldiers who had crossed the border in summer uniforms were now facing temperatures of -30, -40 degrees Celsius. Engine oil froze. Weapons jammed. Frostbite casualties began to outnumber combat casualties in some units. Soviet soldiers, issued with proper winter gear, white camouflage suits, weapons designed to function in extreme cold, counterattacked outside Moscow in December 1941 and pushed the Germans back from the capital's outskirts. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht had been stopped and pushed back. Hitler's response was to fire his top generals and take personal command of the army himself. It was the beginning of a pattern Hitler overriding professional military judgment with his own intuition that would cost Germany dearly in the years ahead. But nothing in the entire Second World War prepared the world for what happened next. The city of Stalingrad. By the summer of 1942, Hitler had launched a second massive offensive in the east, this one driving south toward the Caucasus, toward the Soviet oil fields that Germany desperately needed. Stalingrad was a major industrial city on the Volga River, a vital transport hub, a center of Soviet weapons production, and a city that bore Stalin's name. That last fact made it personally significant to both dictators in a way that transcended military logic. Hitler became obsessed with taking it. Stalin became obsessed with holding it. And two of the largest armies on Earth were fed, piece by piece, into the furnace of a single city. The battle for Stalingrad lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. 6 months. In that time, roughly 2 million people, soldiers and civilians, were killed, wounded, or captured. 2 million human beings in one city in 6 months. The fighting was unlike anything even the veterans of the Eastern Front had experienced. Because the Germans reached the city, they pushed Soviet forces back to the very banks of the Volga. And then the battle became something else entirely. It became a battle for individual buildings, individual floors, individual rooms. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the defenders of Stalingrad, developed a tactic he called hugging the enemy, keeping Soviet forces so close to the German lines that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb Soviet positions without hitting their own men. It turned the city into a labyrinth of close-quarters combat, so savage and so relentless that German soldiers gave it a name: Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. There was a factory in Stalingrad called the Red October Steel Plant. For weeks, German and Soviet forces fought for control of it, not just the building, but individual workshops, individual furnaces, individual rooms within the factory. Men fought with rifles, with grenades, with entrenching tools, with their bare hands. The front line moved room by room. Sometimes a wall was the difference between Soviet and German territory. Soldiers on both sides wrote letters home that sound like dispatches from another world. A German officer wrote to his family, "Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames. And when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to gain the other bank. The nights of Stalingrad are a terror for them. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure." A Soviet soldier's letter. "I don't know if I will post this. There is nowhere to post it from. We are in the basement of what used to be a school. Above us, I think the Germans are on the second floor. We can hear them. They can hear us. We are all just waiting." And then, in November 1942, the Soviets sprung a trap. An operation called Uranus, planned in secret over months, while Stalingrad burned and bled and absorbed German attention. Soviet forces, fresh and fully equipped, launched a massive counteroffensive, not into the city, but around it, striking the flanks of the German position, which were held by weaker Romanian and Italian allies. The flanks collapsed. Within 4 days, the entire German Sixth Army, 300,000 men, commanded by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, was surrounded. Encircled inside the ruins of the city they had been trying to capture. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. He told Paulus to hold. He told him supplies would come by air. He told him relief forces would break through. The supplies never came in sufficient quantity. The relief forces were stopped and pushed back. Through December and January, trapped in the rubble of Stalingrad, the Sixth Army slowly died. Starvation, frostbite, Soviet pressure from every direction. Soldiers who had been fighting for months, with no food, no ammunition, no hope. On January 31st, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, promoted by Hitler to Field Marshal just days earlier, in the apparent expectation that he would die rather than surrendered. He was the first German Field Marshal in history to be taken prisoner. 91,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Of those 91,000, only about 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest died in Soviet prison camps over the following years. Back in Germany, the news was devastating. For the first time, the Nazi propaganda machine, which had carefully managed the presentation of the war to the German public, could not spin what had happened at Stalingrad into a victory. Goebbels declared 4 days of national mourning. Radio stations played nothing but somber classical music. The German people understood, for the first time, that this war might not end the way they had been promised. Stalingrad was the hinge of the Eastern Front, the moment when the tide slowly, painfully, at unimaginable cost, began to turn. The Soviet Union had absorbed blows that would have shattered any other nation. It had lost territory, people, cities, resources on a scale that defies comprehension. And it had not broken. It had bent almost to the ground, and then it had straightened up, and now it was angry. But while armies clashed on the Eastern Front, while men froze and burned and starved in the ruins of Stalingrad, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with armies or strategy or the fortunes of war. Something that was happening in the dark, in secret, behind fences, topped with barbed wire, in places whose names the world did not yet know. Something that was not a battle, something that was a crime. The worst crime in human history. That is where we are going next. Chapter 5. The final solution. I want to slow down here. I want to ask you to do something before we go any further. Wherever you are right now, whatever position you're in, whatever's on in the background, just pause for a moment. Just breathe. Because what I'm about to tell you is not a battle. It's not a campaign. It doesn't have heroes in the conventional sense, or turning points, or moments where clever strategy changed everything. What I'm about to tell you is what happens when a modern, educated, culturally sophisticated nation decides systematically, bureaucratically, with paperwork and train schedules and budget allocations to murder every single member of an entire people. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and millions more Roma people, people with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, gay men, Jehovah's Witnesses, political prisoners. This chapter of the war has a name that the Nazis themselves gave it: the final solution. It didn't start with gas chambers. That's the first thing to understand. The Holocaust didn't arrive fully formed. It evolved. It escalated. Step by careful step, over years. Each step making the next one seem somehow more possible, more thinkable to the people carrying it out. It started with laws. In 1933, the year Hitler came to power, Jewish people in Germany began losing their jobs. Lawyers, doctors, professors, civil servants dismissed. Jewish children were expelled from schools. Jewish businesses were boycotted, then seized. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jewish people of German citizenship entirely. They were no longer Germans. They were classified as a separate, inferior racial category. Marriage between Jewish and non-Jewish Germans was criminalized. In November 1938 came Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. In a single night of coordinated violence across Germany and Austria, over 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed, 1,400 synagogues burned, 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps. The streets of German cities were literally covered in broken glass from shattered shop windows, and the world watched, and mostly did nothing. When the war began and Germany started conquering territory, the Jewish population under Nazi control exploded. Suddenly, they weren't dealing with the roughly 500,000 Jewish people who had lived in Germany. They were dealing with millions in Poland, in the Soviet Union, in France, in the Netherlands, across all of occupied Europe. The Nazis tried various approaches: mass deportations, forced ghettos, walled-off sections of cities where Jewish populations were concentrated in conditions of deliberate deprivation. The Warsaw Ghetto, at its peak, held 400,000 people in an area of 1.3 square miles. Starvation was a deliberate policy. People were dying in the streets. And then, after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, came the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units. These were SS formations that followed behind the advancing German army, moving from town to town, village to village, rounding up Jewish people and shooting them, sometimes in forests, sometimes in ravines, sometimes in the town square. The most infamous single site was Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kyiv, Ukraine. On September 29th and 30th, 1,941. Over 2 days, 33,771 Jewish people were marched to the edge of that ravine and shot. 33,771 people. In 2 days, the men carrying out these killings were not, for the most part, monsters in any obvious sense. They were ordinary men, policemen, soldiers, clerks, farmers who had been conscripted into these units. Historian Christopher Browning studied one such unit, Reserve Police Battalion, 101 inches. Extraordinary detail. His conclusion was deeply disturbing. These were ordinary men, given a choice, in some cases, about whether to participate, and most of them chose to participate because orders, because peer pressure, because ideology had done its work over years of propaganda, because it was easier to pull the trigger than to be the one man who said no. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, described it as the banality of evil. Evil not as a roaring, obvious Hollywood villain force, but as something quiet, bureaucratic, administrative. Evil as paperwork. By late 1941, even the Einsatzgruppen weren't killing fast enough. The Nazi leadership convened a conference. January 20th, 1942. A villa in a wealthy Berlin suburb called Wannsee. Senior SS and government officials sat around a table and discussed, in the language of bureaucratic euphemism, the logistics of murdering every Jewish person in Europe. The Wannsee conference lasted about 90 minutes. They had lunch afterward. The minutes of that meeting, the Wannsee Protocol, survived the war. It is one of the most chilling documents in human history. Not because it contains explicit descriptions of murder, but because it doesn't. It discusses the evacuation and special treatment of 11 million people, the total Jewish population of Europe, in the calm, procedural language of a corporate planning meeting. That language was deliberate. It was designed to create distance, to make the unthinkable thinkable, by never quite saying what was actually being planned. What was actually being planned was an industrial system of mass murder. The death camps: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, built in occupied Poland, away from German population centers, connected to the railway network that spread across all of occupied Europe. Trains arrived from France, from the Netherlands, from Greece, from Hungary, from all across the continent, packed so tightly that people died during the journey. When the trains arrived at Auschwitz, the largest of the camps, the one that has become, in many ways, the symbol of the Holocaust, the passengers were unloaded on a platform called the Juden ramp, or later, the Birkenau ramp. End quote. And there, SS doctors conducted what they called a selection. You walked past the doctor. He looked at you, and with a flick of his hand, left or right, he decided whether you lived or died. Left capable of work, you would be registered, tattooed, with a number, assigned to forced labor in the camp's factories and construction projects. Right unfit for work, the elderly, the very young, mothers who were holding children because holding a child was a signal that you were encumbered, the sick, the disabled. Those sent right, typically 70 to 80% of each transport, were told they were going to shower and be deloused. They were directed to undressing rooms. They were told to remember which hook their clothes were on, so they could find them again afterward. They were even given soap, and then the doors were sealed, and Zyklon B pellets were dropped through openings in the ceiling. It took approximately 20 minutes. At peak operation in 1944, Auschwitz was killing 6,000 people per day. 6,000 people per day. I want to tell you about one person. Her name was Anne Frank. She was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1929. Her family fled to Amsterdam when Hitler came to power. When the Germans occupied the Netherlands in 1940, the noose began to tighten there too. In July 1942, Anne was 13 years old. Her family went into hiding. They concealed themselves in a secret annex of rooms, hidden behind a bookcase in the building where her father worked. 8 people in a hidden space, roughly the size of a small apartment. For 2 years, Anne kept a diary. She wrote about ordinary things, her dreams, her arguments with her mother, her developing feelings for the boy hiding with them, her hopes for the future. She wanted to be a writer. She wrote, "I want to go on living, even after my death." She also wrote about the war outside, about the sounds of bombing, about the friends and neighbors who had disappeared, about what she could see from the tiny windows they could barely approach for fear of being spotted. In August 1944, someone, it has never been definitively established, who betrayed the hiding place to the Gestapo. The 8 people in the annex were arrested. Anne Frank and her sister Margot were sent to Auschwitz, then to Bergen-Belsen. Anne Frank died in Bergen-Belsen in February or March of 1945. The exact date is unknown. She was 15 years old. She died of typhus a few weeks before British forces liberated the camp. Her diary was found in the annex after the war. Her father, Otto, the only one of the 8 to survive, published it. It has since sold over 30 million copies. It has been translated into more than 70 languages. She got her wish. She went on living after her death. But she should have lived. She should have grown up. She should have written her books and argued with her mother and fallen in and out of love and grown old. She was 15 years old. There were people who resisted. Let me be clear about that. Because sometimes the Holocaust is told in a way that strips its victims of all agency, as if they simply went quietly, as if there was no resistance, no defiance, no refusal to be erased. That is not true. In April 1943, the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto rose up. The ghetto had once held 400,000 people. By April 1943, through deportations to Treblinka and starvation, it held perhaps 50,000. The Germans came to liquidate what remained to clear the ghetto entirely, and the survivors, armed with smuggled pistols, a handful of rifles, and improvised explosives, chose to fight. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising lasted 4 weeks. Against SS forces backed by artillery, tanks, and flamethrowers, the Jewish fighters, most of them in their 20s, most of them knowing exactly how this would end, held out for a month. Their commander was a 2-3-year-old named Mordecai Anielewicz. He wrote a letter near the end. "The dream of my life has risen to become fact. Jewish self-defense in the Warsaw Ghetto has become a fact. Jewish armed resistance and revenge are facts. I have been a witness to the magnificent, heroic fighting of Jewish men in battle." He died in the ghetto. He was 24 years old. There were also non-Jewish people who chose to help. People who hid Jewish neighbors in their attics, their basements, their barns, who forged papers, smuggled food, risked their own lives and the lives of their families for people they sometimes barely knew. In many occupied countries, being caught hiding Jewish people was a death sentence, not just for you, but for your entire family. Some people hid people anyway. The world tends to remember the collaborators, the people who informed, who participated, who looked away, and we should remember them. But we should also remember the others, the ones who chose differently. By the time the war ended, 6 million Jewish people had been murdered. 6 million, 1/3 of the entire global Jewish population. 90% of Poland's Jewish community gone. Entire communities with their languages, their music, their food, their stories, their traditions, their particular way of laughing and arguing and praying erased. Primo Levi survived Auschwitz. He spent the rest of his life trying to bear witness, to find words adequate to what had happened. He wrote, "It happened. Therefore, it can happen again." This is the core of what we have to say. Elie Wiesel, another survivor, another witness, said something that has stayed with me. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. So we don't forget. We say the names, even when there are too many names to say. We look at the faces in the photographs, even when looking is almost unbearable. We read the diaries, even the ones that end mid-sentence, because the person writing them was taken away. We remember, because remembering is the only thing that stands between us and forgetting. And forgetting, as Levi warned us, is where the danger lives. Chapter 6. The tide turns. There is a particular kind of hope that only exists in the darkest places. Not the easy hope of someone who has never lost anything. Not the bright, unearned optimism of people who have never had reason to doubt. This is a different kind, harder, quieter. The hope of people who have seen the worst that the world can do, who have stood in the rubble of everything they built and everything they loved, and who choose, against all reasonable evidence, to believe that it is not over yet. By the end of 1942, that is the only kind of hope the Allied world had left. But it was there, and it was about to become something more. Let's start in the desert. North Africa. A landscape so alien, so stripped of everything. No trees, no cover, no landmarks, just sand and rock and blinding sun that soldiers on both sides sometimes described it as the only clean war. A war of movement and maneuver, of tanks and supply lines, of men who respected each other across the battle lines in a way that the Eastern Front made simply impossible. The German commander in North Africa was Erwin Rommel, and Rommel was something rare in the senior ranks of the Wehrmacht, a general who was genuinely brilliant in the field, audacious, fast-thinking, personally brave in a way that made his men willing to follow him anywhere. He had a gift for seeing the battlefield 3 moves ahead, and for moving faster than his enemy could react. The British called him the Desert Fox. He had driven British forces back across Libya and deep into Egypt. By the summer of 1942, he was just 60 miles from Alexandria, 60 miles from the Nile Delta, from the Suez Canal, from the oil routes that kept the British Empire functioning. Churchill called the fall of Tobruk a key port that Rommel had captured in June 1942, one of the most crushing defeats of the war. But Rommel had a problem that all the battlefield brilliance in the world couldn't solve: supply lines. His tanks needed fuel, his men needed food and ammunition, and everything had to come across the Mediterranean, a sea increasingly controlled by the Royal Navy and the RAF, who were sinking German and Italian supply ships at a devastating rate. By the time of the crucial battle at El Alamein in October 1942, Rommel's forces were critically short of fuel and ammunition. And waiting for him on the other side of the minefield at El Alamein was a new British commander, a difficult, abrasive, intensely self-confident man named Bernard Montgomery. Monty, as everyone called him, was nothing like Rommel in style. Where Rommel improvised and moved fast and trusted his instincts, Montgomery prepared. He refused to attack until he was ready, properly ready, with overwhelming force and a plan that accounted for everything he could account for. His staff found him infuriating. His superiors found him insufferable. His soldiers adored him. On the night of October 23rd, 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein began. Over 1,000 British guns opened fire simultaneously, a barrage that soldiers who survived it described as the ground physically lifting and falling beneath their feet. Then, 200,000 Allied troops and over 1,000 tanks pushed into the German lines. It lasted 12 days. Rommel, who had been in Germany on sick leave when the battle started and rushed back on Hitler's orders, fought with everything he had. He was a master of defensive improvisation. He made Montgomery pay for every yard. But the math was impossible. The British had more men, more tanks, more fuel, more ammunition, and more kept coming. On November 4th, what remained of Rommel's army broke and fled west. The retreat became a rout. Churchill, when he heard the news, ordered church bells rung across Britain for the first time since the start of the war. And he said the words that have defined how we remember that moment ever since. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. And almost simultaneously, on the other side of the Atlantic, on the other side of the entire strategic picture, the Allies landed in French North Africa. Operation Torch, November 8th, 1942. American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria territories controlled by Vichy France, the collaborationist French government that had made its accommodation with Hitler after France's fall. It was the first major American offensive of the war in the European theater, and it was something of a baptism of fire for American troops who had trained hard but had never actually fought. They learned fast. The commander of Torch, and the man who would go on to command the Allied forces in Europe through to the end, was a largely unknown American general named Dwight David Eisenhower. Personable, politically astute, blessed with an extraordinary ability to manage the clashing egos and national rivalries of Allied command, without letting them destroy the coalition. The war had just handed the Allied cause the thing it had been missing most desperately since 1940: momentum. Then came Kursk. If El Alamein was the turning point in the south, and Stalingrad was the turning point in the east, then Kursk was the moment when the turning became irreversible. The summer of 1943. The Soviet Union and Germany are locked in a strategic pause after Stalingrad. The front lines have stabilized around a large bulge, a salient in Soviet-held territory near the Russian city of Kursk. German forces hold the shoulders of the salient on both sides. Hitler's generals proposed an operation codenamed Citadel to pinch off the Kursk salient with a massive armored attack from both sides, encircling and destroying the Soviet forces inside, and restoring German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. It was, on paper, a reasonable plan, except the Soviets knew it was coming. Soviet intelligence, including information passed by a remarkable spy network inside Germany, and signals intelligence that had been steadily improving throughout the war, gave Stalin detailed information about German plans weeks in advance, and the Soviets prepared. What they built around Kursk in the weeks before the German attack was the most elaborate defensive system in military history. 8 separate defensive lines, stretching back 175 miles. Over 1 million mines laid in the fields, more mines per square mile than at any other point in the entire war. Anti-tank ditches, artillery positions carefully calibrated to destroy German armor at specific points. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers dug in and waiting. The Soviets weren't trying to stop the German attack. They were trying to let it come in to absorb it, bleed it dry, and then destroy what remained. On July 5th, 1943, the Germans attacked and ran straight into the trap. What followed was the largest tank battle in history. At its peak, around the village of Prokhorovka on July 12th, somewhere between 600 and 1,200 tanks from both sides, the numbers are still debated, clashed in a space barely 5 miles wide. German Tiger tanks and Soviet T-34s at ranges so close that the technical advantages of the Tiger's superior gun barely mattered. Tanks ramming each other, burning vehicles, blocking the field. Crews bailing out and fighting on foot. One Soviet officer who survived described it this way: "The earth was black, not brown-black. Everything that had been alive on that ground was ash. The air smelled of metal and burning oil." Tanks were still burning 2 days later. The German offensive ground to a halt. And then, as the Soviets had planned, the counterattack came. Fresh Soviet armored forces, held in reserve, drove into the exhausted German flanks. Operation Kutuzov in the north. Operation Rumyantsev in the south. The Germans, who had thrown their best armored units into the Kursk attack, had almost nothing left to stop them. By August, the Soviets had recaptured Oryol and Belgorod cities that had been in German hands for over a year. Hitler's last great offensive gamble in the east had failed. From Kursk onwards, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front belonged to the Soviet Union. Permanently, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive operation in the east. For the remaining 2 years of the war, Germany in the east would only ever be retreating fighting skillfully at enormous cost, but retreating nonetheless. And while all of this was happening on land, on the deserts of Africa and the steppes of Russia, another battle had been raging in the cold, grey waters of the North Atlantic. A battle that was, in some ways, the most important battle of the entire war. The Battle of the Atlantic. Because here is the brutal strategic reality of Britain's position in this war. Britain is an island. Everything it needs, food, oil, raw materials, American weapons, and supplies under Lend-Lease. Everything comes by ship across the Atlantic. And Germany knew this. German U-boat submarines had been hunting Allied convoys since the first days of the war. In 1942, they sank over 1,600 Allied ships. The tonnage going to the bottom of the Atlantic was exceeding the rate at which new ships could be built. If that continued, if the Atlantic supply line could be cut, Britain would eventually starve and run dry of fuel, and the whole Allied war effort would collapse. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him throughout the war. Not the Blitz, not the fall of France, the submarines. The turning point came in 1943 through a combination of improved technology, better tactics, and crucially, the breaking of the German naval Enigma codes. Allied convoys were now being routed around U-boat wolf packs instead of into them. Long-range aircraft, particularly the B-24 Liberator, began closing the Black Gap in the mid-Atlantic, where convoys had previously had no air cover. New weapons, better radar, improved depth charges gave Allied escort ships a decisive edge. In May 1943, a month, the Germans called Black May, the Allies sank 41 U-boats in a single month. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat fleet, withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. He wrote in his war diary, "We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The supply line held. America's industrial output could now flow to Britain and the Soviet Union unimpeded. 1,943 ended, with the Allies on the move everywhere. The Axis had been cleared from North Africa. Sicily had been invaded and taken. Italy itself had been invaded, and Mussolini, the man who had dreamed of a new Roman Empire, had been deposed by his own government, arrested, and eventually rescued by German commandos in a dramatic glider raid, only to become a puppet ruler of a German-occupied rump state in northern Italy. The Soviet Union was advancing on the Eastern Front, on a scale that Germany had no hope of matching. The Atlantic was open, and in Britain, an enormous, sprawling, enormously complex operation was being planned. The largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. An operation that would put Allied boots on the beaches of Nazi-occupied France and open the front that Germany had feared since 1941. The Allies were not just surviving anymore. They were planning the knockout blow. But I want to pause here for a second, before we get to the beaches and the bombers and the final storm, because in all of this, in the grand sweep of turning tides and strategic reversals, it's easy to lose sight of what these battles actually cost, what they felt like from the inside. At El Alamein, the British lost 13,500 men killed or wounded in 12 days. At Kursk, Soviet casualties were around 860,000 killed, wounded, missing in a single summer offensive. In the Battle of the Atlantic, 30,000 Allied merchant sailors died at sea. Ordinary men, not soldiers, not trained combatants, men who drove ships carrying food and fuel and tanks, who knew the submarines were out there, who went anyway because the supplies had to get through. Every one of those numbers is a person, someone's son, someone's father, someone's husband who left on a morning that felt ordinary and never came home. The tide was turning. That is true. But the cost of turning it was paid in a currency that never stops being real. Human lives. Chapter 7. The Last Storm. June 5th, 1944. Midnight. In the darkness over the English Channel, 822 aircraft are crossing toward the coast of France. Inside them, 13,000 American, British, and Canadian paratroopers, faces blackened, equipment strapped tight, each man carrying everything he will need to fight and possibly die in the next few hours. Some of them are praying. Some are joking, the way soldiers joke when they are terrified, loudly, about nothing. Some are staring at the floor of the aircraft, somewhere far inside themselves, in a place no one else can reach. Below them, invisible in the darkness, the English Channel is filled with ships, not dozens of ships, not hundreds. Nearly 7,000 vessels, the largest naval armada ever assembled in the history of warfare, stretching back toward the English coast as far as the eye can see. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, supply ships, tugboats, minesweepers, moving south through the night in near total radio silence. 156,000 men are about to land on 5 beaches on the coast of Normandy, France. This is D-Day. The man who had planned it, who had spent 18 months building and organizing and arguing and compromising and cajoling the most complex military operation in human history into something that might actually work, was Dwight Eisenhower. And on the evening of June 5th, after he had given the order to go, after there was nothing more he could do, he sat down alone and wrote a note he kept in his wallet. Our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He wrote the failure speech before the battle began. He put it in his pocket, and then he went out to talk to the paratroopers before they boarded their planes. A journalist photographed him there, Eisenhower, in his general's jacket, surrounded by young soldiers with their faces painted, talking, laughing, clapping them on the shoulders. He looks, in that photograph, like a man carrying something very heavy and determined not to let it show. Those men were about to jump out of aircraft over occupied France in the middle of the night. He knew that some percentage of them, he didn't know what percentage, would not survive the next 24 hours. He shook their hands. He wished them luck, and then they were gone. The paratroopers went in first, in the hours before dawn. Their drops were scattered by cloud, anti-aircraft fire, and pilot error. Instead of landing in concentrated groups on their designated drop zones, thousands of men came down, spread across miles of Norman countryside. Some drowned in fields that the Germans had flooded specifically to kill paratroopers. Some landed in the middle of German positions. Some came down alone, miles from anyone, in the dark, in enemy territory, with no idea where they were. Private John Steele of the 82nd Airborne had his parachute snag on the church steeple of a village called Sainte-Mère-Église. He hung there for 2 hours, playing dead, watching his fellow paratroopers land in the town square below and be shot, while the village burned from a fire that had started before the drop. He was eventually taken prisoner, escaped, and rejoined his unit. That story sounds like something from a film. It happened. There is still a mannequin hanging from that church steeple today to remember him. The scattered drops, chaotic as they were, had an unintended benefit. German commanders trying to make sense of reports coming in from all across the region, couldn't identify where the main Allied effort was. Confusion bought time, and at dawn 6:30 inches the morning, the landing craft hit the beaches. 5 beaches, code-named Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At 4 of them, Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword, the landings were hard and costly, but the men got off the beaches. The defenses were overcome. By the end of the day, footholds had been established. At Omaha, it was different. Omaha Beach was a killing ground. The beach was overlooked by bluffs rising 100 to 170 feet, and those bluffs were held by a German division that happened to be conducting exercises in the area, one of the better German divisions in Normandy, in position by coincidence, not design. The preliminary naval bombardment had missed most of the German fortifications. Many of the specially designed tanks meant to provide fire support on the beach had sunk in the rough seas before reaching shore. The men of the first wave came off the landing craft ramps directly into withering fire. Machine guns, mortars, artillery. Men died before they reached the waterline. Men drowned under the weight of their equipment. Men who made it to the beach found almost no cover, pressed against a low sea wall, unable to move forward, unable to go back. By mid-morning, the situation at Omaha was so dire that senior commanders were considering abandoning the beach entirely. And then, in small groups, led by sergeants and lieutenants, and sometimes just whoever was still alive and willing to move men, began to climb the bluffs. Not because orders came down from above, because someone decided, because someone stood up in the fire and said, "This way, follow me." By the end of June 6th, 1944, the Allies had lost approximately 10,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing across all 5 beaches. At Omaha alone, around 2,000 Americans died, but they held the beaches, all 5 of them. Hitler, asleep in his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden when the landings began, was not woken by his staff. They were afraid to wake him. When he was finally told, hours after the landings had started, he reportedly laughed. He believed this was a feint, that the real invasion was still coming at Pas-de-Calais, further north. He held his reserve panzer divisions back, waiting for an attack that wasn't coming. It was one of the most consequential decisions of the war. Those panzer divisions, committed to Normandy in the first hours of June 6th, might have pushed the Allied landings back into the sea. Held back by Hitler's miscalculation and by an elaborate Allied deception operation called Fortitude that had spent months convincing the Germans that the main attack was coming elsewhere. They arrived too late, the beachhead held. Through June and July, Allied forces broke out of Normandy. By late August, Paris was liberated French forces leading the way into their own capital. Crowds lining the streets, weeping and cheering. 4 years of occupation suddenly, almost incomprehensibly, over. General Charles de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées. Someone fired shots, German snipers, or maybe just someone with a gun, and poor judgment. The crowd scattered. De Gaulle kept walking. Paris was free. On the Eastern Front, at almost the same moment as D-Day, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, their massive summer offensive against German Army Group Center. In 2 months, the Soviets advanced 350 miles. Army Group Center, one of the primary German forces on the Eastern Front, was effectively destroyed. German casualties in Bagration exceeded even those at Stalingrad. It was, by most military measures, the most devastating defeat in the history of the German army. The Third Reich was now being crushed from both sides simultaneously. And inside Germany itself, a group of German officers, men who had served the regime, who had commanded its armies, who had watched it lead their country to catastrophe, decided that there was only one way to stop the destruction. Kill Hitler, July 20th, 1944. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a highly decorated Wehrmacht officer who had lost his right hand, 2 fingers of his left hand, and his left eye in combat in North Africa, carried a briefcase into a conference room at Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia. Inside the briefcase was a bomb. He placed it under the conference table, as close to Hitler as he could get, then excused himself on the pretext of making a phone call. The bomb detonated at 12:42 p.m. 4 people in the room were killed. Hitler survived. A heavy oak table support had partly shielded him from the blast. He walked out of the ruins of the conference room with a damaged arm, burst eardrums, and singed hair. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Nearly 5,000 people were executed in connection with the plot, some directly involved, many only tangentially connected, some with no real connection at all. Stauffenberg was shot in a Berlin courtyard the same night. Other plotters were sentenced by a show trial and hanged with piano wire. Hitler had ordered their executions filmed so he could watch the footage later. The resistance inside Germany had been its last real chance to end the war from within. It had come within inches and failed. By the end of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its final, brutal phase. The Allies were advancing from the west. The Soviets were advancing from the east. Germany was being compressed from both directions, its cities being bombed to rubble around the clock by British and American air forces, its industrial capacity collapsing, its fuel supplies drying up, its manpower reserves exhausted. In December 1944, Hitler launched one final, desperate gamble in the West, a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the same route that had worked so brilliantly in 1940. If German forces could break through to the port of Antwerp, they could cut Allied supply lines and potentially force a negotiated peace in the West. It was called the Battle of the Bulge. In the opening days, it worked. German forces punched through thinly held American lines in freezing winter conditions, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front and surrounding the crucial crossroads town of Bastogne. The American commander at Bastogne, General Anthony McAuliffe, received a German demand to surrender. His reply was a single word: nuts. The Germans weren't sure, at first, if this was an American slang term or an actual response. It was both. Bastogne held. Patton's Third Army drove north through the snow in one of the most impressive feats of military movement in the entire war and broke the German siege. The bulge cost 75,000 American casualties, but it cost Germany far more forces and fuel it could not replace. January 1945. The end was coming. Soviet forces crossed into Germany itself. German civilians who had been told for years by Nazi propaganda that they were winning, that the war was going well, that the Führer had a plan, now experienced firsthand what years of German brutality in the East had set in motion. The Soviet advance was accompanied by acts of terrible violence against German civilians, not random, systematic retribution in the minds of many Soviet soldiers for what Germany had done to their country, their cities, their families. By April 1945, Soviet forces were in the suburbs of Berlin itself. Hitler was in his bunker, a concrete shelter, buried 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden. He was 56 years old, and he looked, by the accounts of everyone who saw him in those final weeks, like a broken man. His left hand shook uncontrollably. He shuffled rather than walked. He had been dependent on amphetamines and other drugs injected daily by his personal physician. He spent his final days moving imaginary armies on maps, armies that no longer existed, divisions that had been destroyed, units that existed only on paper. His generals stood around him and nodded and said nothing. On April 29th, 1945, he married Eva Braun, his companion of many years, in a small ceremony in the bunker. The following day, April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops less than a mile away, Adolf Hitler shot himself. Eva Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were carried up to the Reich Chancellery Garden and burned in accordance with Hitler's instructions. He had said he would not allow his body to be displayed like Mussolini's, who had been captured by Italian partisans a day earlier, shot, and hung upside down from a lamppost in Milan. On May 8th, 1945 VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, Germany surrendered unconditionally. In London, in New York, in Paris, in Moscow, people poured into the streets. They were laughing and weeping at the same time, which is a thing the human face does when relief is so enormous it has nowhere else to go. 6 years, tens of millions dead, an entire continent in ruins. It was over. In Europe, but in the Pacific, the war went on. Japan had been losing for 2 years, losing islands, losing naval battles, losing the air war as American pilots and aircraft improved, and Japanese replacements grew less and less experienced. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines the way U-boats had once threatened Britain's. By early 1945, American B-29 bombers were reaching the Japanese home islands, and General Curtis LeMay had shifted from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude firebombing of Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th, 1945, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would later kill. 16 square miles of the city were burned to ash, and still, Japan did not surrender. The Japanese military leadership and the culture it had built around the concept of death before dishonor, around fighting to the last man, around the emperor as a living god whose divine will transcended individual survival, could not find a path to surrender, or would not. Allied planners began preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The estimates for casualties on both sides were appalling. American planners projected between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. Japanese military and civilian casualties in an invasion could have reached several million. The question was not whether the war could be won, it was how much more it would cost. And then, in the desert of New Mexico, on July 16th, 1945, a new and terrible answer was provided. The Trinity test, the first detonation of an atomic bomb in human history. The physicist Robert Oppenheimer, watching the fireball rise into the New Mexico sky, thought of a line from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The bomb worked. President Harry Truman Roosevelt had died of a cerebral hemorrhage in April, just weeks before Germany's surrender. Never seeing the final victory he had worked toward for years, was informed of the successful test while attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany. he authorized its use against Japan. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 inches the morning, a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay dropped a single atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The pilot was Colonel Paul Tibbets. He had named the aircraft after his mother. The bomb, called Little Boy, detonated at an altitude of 1,900 feet above the city. The fireball reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Within a radius of 1 mile, everything was instantly incinerated. Within 2 miles, almost everything was destroyed. Approximately 80,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more died in the weeks and months that followed from radiation, sickness, burns, and injuries. A city of 350,000 people was destroyed in 43 seconds. Tibbets, looking back from the aircraft, saw the mushroom cloud rising over what had been Hiroshima and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "My God, what have we done?" Japan still did not surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Approximately 40,000 people died instantly. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio broadcast. It was the first time most Japanese people had ever heard his voice. In formal, archaic Japanese that many listeners struggled to understand, he announced that Japan would accept the terms of surrender. He did not use the word surrender. He said that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Ace. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese representatives signed the formal surrender document. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony. He had kept his promise. He had returned. World War II was over. 70 to 85 million people were dead. That number, depending on whose methodology you use, whose dead you count, and how, is so large that it resists comprehension. So let me try again to make it real. If you lined up every person who died in World War II shoulder to shoulder, the way people stand in a crowd, that line would stretch around the equator nearly 3 times. More than half of them were civilians. Not soldiers, not combatants. Civilians. People in cities that were bombed. People in villages that were burned. People in camps. People on ships. People who happened to be somewhere when war decided to come through. They weren't footnotes. They were the story. The war had ended. But what it had left behind, the questions it had opened, the world it had made, the things it had shown about what human beings are capable of, both the worst and the very best, those did not end. Those are still with us. And that is where we are going next. Chapter 8. What we carry forward. The guns stopped, and for a moment, just a moment, there was silence. Not peace, not yet. Just the sudden, strange, almost incomprehensible absence of noise that had been the background of the entire world for 6 years. The silence of a planet that had forgotten what quiet felt like, suddenly remembering. And then, into that silence, came everything that silence brings. Grief, exhaustion, the slow, dawning realization of what had been lost. And somewhere underneath all of it, fragile, uncertain, but real, the first tentative question. Now what? The world that emerged from World War II was not the world that had gone in. It couldn't be. Nothing that passes through a fire that large comes out the same shape. Europe, the continent that had, for 4 centuries, dominated the world through its empires and its industry and its military power was shattered. Its great cities were rubble. Its economies were destroyed. Its populations were displaced on a scale that defies easy description. Somewhere between 40 and 60 million Europeans had been uprooted from their homes during the war. Refugees, forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, people who had simply fled and had nowhere to return to. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was one of the coldest in European memory. In cities like Berlin and Warsaw and Vienna, people were burning furniture to stay warm. Food was so scarce that in some areas, caloric intake had dropped below what is considered subsistence level. Children who had been born at the start of the war were now 6 years old and had never known anything except destruction. This was the world the survivors inherited. This was where the rebuilding had to begin. But before the rebuilding, there was a reckoning. In the autumn of 1945, in the German city of Nuremberg, chosen deliberately because it was in Nuremberg that the Nazi Party had held its great rallying spectacles, where Hitler had stood before hundreds of thousands and been worshipped like a god. An international tribunal convened. The Nuremberg trials. 24 senior Nazi leaders sat in the dock. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German High Command. Albert Speer, the architect and armaments minister, who had used slave labor to fuel Germany's war machine, and who now, in the dock, deployed a carefully constructed persona of remorseful ignorance that historians have argued about ever since. They were charged with crimes that had barely existed in international law before the war. Crimes against peace, the planning and waging of aggressive war. War crimes, violations of the laws and customs of warfare, and a new category, coined for these trials because the existing vocabulary of law was simply inadequate. Crimes against humanity. That phrase, crimes against humanity, had to be invented because what had happened in the camps and the killing fields and the ghettos of occupied Europe was something that existing law had no category for. It was something that transcended the relationship between a government and its own citizens, or between belligerent armies. It was something that the entire human species had a stake in prosecuting. The principle established at Nuremberg was radical in its simplicity. Some things are wrong, regardless of who orders them. Following orders is not a defense. There are crimes so fundamental, so absolute in their violation of human dignity, that every individual, every soldier, every bureaucrat, every person with a role in a chain of command bears personal responsibility for refusing to commit them. This was new. This mattered. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death. Others received long prison sentences. Göring vain, theatrical, impossible to ignore, even in a dock, cheated the hangman by swallowing a cyanide capsule the night before his scheduled execution. No one has ever definitively established how he obtained it. The trials were not perfect. Victor's justice, some called them. The Soviet Union sat in judgment of Nazi atrocities, while Stalin's own gulags held millions. The carpet bombing of German and Japanese cities, which had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, was never examined in the dock. But imperfect as they were, the Nuremberg trials established something that had not existed before. The idea that the international community had not just the right, but the obligation to hold individuals accountable for crimes of this magnitude. That sovereignty, the right of a state to do what it wished within its own borders, was not absolute. That there were lines that could not be crossed without consequence, regardless of what uniform you wore or what flag flew above your head. Every international criminal tribunal that has met since, for the former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, for Sierra Leone, the International Criminal Court itself stands on the foundation that was poured at Nuremberg in 1945 and 1946, and out of the rubble of the war came other things that were also new. The United Nations, founded in 1945, with the explicit purpose of providing the international body for dialogue and collective security that the League of Nations had failed to be. Not perfect. Anyone who has watched the Security Council operate knows it is far from perfect, but present. A forum. A place where, at minimum, the argument happens before the shooting. Sometimes. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, a document that tried to enumerate, for the first time in a single text, the basic rights that belong to every human being by virtue of being human, not by virtue of citizenship or race or religion or gender. Just human. Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the committee that drafted it. She called it the International Magna Carta of all mankind. It was written by people who had just watched what happens when those rights are systematically stripped away. They were not writing in the abstract. They were writing from the bone. The Marshall Plan, the American program that pumped $13 billion, equivalent to roughly $150 billion today, into rebuilding the shattered economies of Western Europe. Not because America was altruistic beyond measure, because America had learned from the disaster of Versailles what happens when a defeated enemy is left to starve and rot in its own humiliation. Because grinding poverty and national resentment, as the 1930s had demonstrated with brutal clarity, are the soil in which monsters grow. The European project, what would eventually become the European Union, born from the idea that France and Germany, which had gone to war 3 times in 70 years, needed to be economically and politically integrated so deeply that war between them would become not just unlikely, but structurally impossible. That shared prosperity is a more durable peace than any treaty. These things did not fall from the sky. They were built, deliberately, by people who had lived through the war and were determined not naively, not without argument and compromise and failure to make something different from the wreckage. And then there was the bomb. The atomic bomb changed everything in a way that is still difficult to fully articulate, even now, more than 80 years later. Before August 6, 1945, war, however terrible, however costly, was something that human civilizations had survived. Cities were destroyed and rebuilt. Populations were devastated and recovered. The worst wars in history had been catastrophic, but not existential. The species went on. After Hiroshima, that was no longer guaranteed. For the first time in history, human beings had in their hands the technological capacity to end human civilization. Not metaphorically, literally. A sufficient exchange of nuclear weapons would not just destroy cities or defeat nations. It would render large portions of the earth uninhabitable. It would kill not just those alive now, but potentially those not yet born through radiation, through the collapse of agriculture, through what scientists later came to call nuclear winter. The Cold War that followed World War II, the 40-year standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, was shaped entirely by this reality. 2 superpowers, each capable of destroying the other many times over, locked in a competition that both understood could not be allowed to go all the way. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, and yes, the acronym was intentional, was the logic that kept the nuclear peace. It is a fragile logic. It depends on rationality, under pressure, on communication lines that work, on leaders who don't miscalculate or misread or make decisions in the middle of the night, on inadequate information. It has held so far. So far. I want to talk about something that doesn't always make it into histories of World War II. What the war changed for the people who didn't fight it. Women in the Allied nations had entered the workforce in enormous numbers during the war, not because anyone had suddenly decided to believe in gender equality, but because the factories needed workers and the men were gone. Rosie the Riveter wasn't a feminist icon originally. She was a practical necessity. After the war, many women were pushed back out of those jobs when the men returned. The 1950s ideal of the suburban housewife was, in part, a deliberate cultural project to restore a pre-war gender order that had been disrupted. But the disruption had happened. Women had done the work. They knew they had done it. And that knowledge, that experience, did not disappear. It fed directly into the feminist movements of the 1960s and beyond. The war planted a seed that the post-war decade tried to suppress and couldn't. In Asia and Africa, something similar happened. The war had shattered the myth of European invincibility. People who had spent their entire lives under colonial rule had watched their European colonizers be humiliated, defeated, occupied. The British surrendering Singapore to a smaller Japanese force. The French falling in 6 weeks. The Dutch driven out of Indonesia. The presumption of white European superiority, which had been the ideological engine of colonialism for centuries, had been exposed in the most public and dramatic way possible as a lie. India achieved independence in 1947. Indonesia in 1945. Vietnam began its independence struggle against France first, then against America almost immediately after the war ended. Across Africa, through the 1950s and 1960s, colony after colony moved toward independence. The end of European empire was not caused solely by World War II. These were complex, multifaceted historical processes driven by local conditions, local leaders, local struggles. But the war cracked the foundation, and once cracked, it could not be repaired. And what about Germany and Japan? Both nations did something that history gives them insufficient credit for. They rebuilt. Not just economically, though. The German and Japanese economic recoveries of the post-war decades were remarkable by any measure. But culturally, morally, psychologically, Germany undertook a process called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, literally, coming to terms with the past that has no real equivalent in any other nation's history. German schools teach the Holocaust in detail. German law makes Holocaust denial a criminal offense. The stumbling stones, Stolperstein, small brass plaques, set into pavements across German cities, each one bearing the name of a Jewish person who lived at that address before being deported, number over 100,000 across Europe. Germany did not forget. It chose not to forget. It built forgetting into illegality and remembering into infrastructure. That choice, as imperfect and ongoing and contested as it remains, is one of the more remarkable things any nation has done in the aftermath of catastrophe. Now, I want to bring this home. I want to bring it all the way back to right now. To you, wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever city you're in, because history is not something that happened to other people in another time. It is the ground you are standing on. The world you live in tonight, the international institutions, the human rights frameworks, the nuclear deterrence structure, the integrated European economy that has kept France and Germany at peace for 80 years, the post-colonial world map, the very idea that individuals can be held accountable by international law for crimes against humanity. All of it emerged from the wreckage of World War II. The people who built those things were not saints. They were exhausted, traumatized, often deeply flawed human beings who had lived through the worst of the world could produce, and who decided, in the face of everything they had seen, that it was worth trying to build something better. They argued, they compromised, they got it wrong, repeatedly. Some of the structures they built have frayed or failed. The United Nations has not prevented all wars. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has not been universally honored. The nuclear arsenals still exist. But they tried. They tried when they had every reason to simply give up, every reason to conclude that human beings were not worth the effort of building institutions to protect them. That effort matters. There are three things that I keep coming back to. Three things that this story, told in its entirety, seems to insist on. The first is this: darkness does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive wearing a sign that says danger. It arrives slowly, in steps. In each step, a choice that seems in isolation, in the context of the moment manageable, defensible, reasonable even. The Nuremberg laws didn't come on day one of Hitler's Germany. Kristallnacht didn't happen in 1933. The death camps weren't built until there had been years of smaller escalations, each one making the next seem less unthinkable. The people who watched those steps and did nothing, not because they were evil, but because each individual step seemed like something that could be waited out, managed, lived with those people, are the warning. Not the monsters. The bystanders, because the bystanders were ordinary. They were people with families and jobs and opinions about the weather and preferences in music. They were people exactly like us. And they watched and waited and told themselves it would not get worse. It got worse. The second thing is this: ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. We have heard in this story about generals and presidents and prime ministers, about Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin and Eisenhower, but the war was not won by them alone. It was won by the 20-year-old RAF pilot who climbed into his Spitfire for the fourth time in a single day, hands shaking, and went anyway. By the Soviet woman who drove a tank at Kursk because her brother had been killed and someone had to, by the Jewish fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto, who knew exactly how his story would end and chose to fight anyway because dignity demanded it. By the Dutch family who hid strangers in their attic for 2 years, knowing that if they were discovered, everyone in the house would be shot. By the codebreakers in their basement who never fired a weapon and saved more lives than most armies. By the merchant sailors who crossed the Atlantic in the knowledge that submarines were looking for them because the supplies had to get through. By the soldiers on Omaha Beach who had every rational reason to stay behind that seawall and who stood up anyway. None of them were superhuman. None of them were without fear. Every single one of them was afraid. They went anyway. And that choice, made in fear, made without certainty, made because something mattered enough to be worth the cost, is what heroism actually looks like. Not the absence of fear, the decision to act in spite of it. And the third thing, the last thing, you are here because they held. I mean that literally. Every person listening to this tonight is the descendant, biological or cultural or both, of someone who survived the Second World War. Every one of you exists because somewhere in the chain of events that leads to your life, someone made it through. A soldier who came home, a family that fled in time, a village that wasn't bombed, a hiding place that wasn't found. 70 to 85 million people died in that war. And yet, Here we are, billions of us, living in a world that, for all its profound and real problems, has not seen a war between great powers since 1945. A world with fewer people dying in conflict than at almost any point in recorded history. A world where the ideas of human rights and international law and democratic governance, however imperfectly realized, are the baseline assumptions of global civilization rather than radical propositions. That world was not inevitable. It was chosen, built, defended by people who had every reason to despair and refuse to. So when the world feels dark, and it will feel dark, because the world sometimes is, I want you to remember something. It has been darker. People have stood in the ruins of everything, with nothing left, and they have looked at each other and said, "We are still here. We are still here, and there is still work to do, and we are going to do it." That is the thing World War II ultimately teaches, if you let it. Not that human beings are irredeemably violent. Not that civilization is fragile and doomed. Not that the darkness always wins. It teaches that the darkness has limits, that it can be survived, that on the other side of the worst the world has ever done, it is still possible, difficult, costly, imperfect, worth it to build something worth living in. The people who did it for us were not extraordinary in the beginning. They became extraordinary through what they chose, in the moments that asked something of them. We are their children. The question the world always eventually asks, in one form or another, in one generation or another, is whether we are worthy of what they gave us. I think we are. I think you are. Thank you for being here tonight, for staying with this story all the way to the end. Wherever you are, whatever city, whatever time, I hope you sleep well, and I hope you wake up tomorrow and see the world you live in with just a little more weight to it. Just a little more understanding of what it cost and what it means and why it matters. We remember them. Good night.